somebody will pick me up. As so many people have said already who have spoken, it is an honor to be here. I've been watching from Ottawa, where I live, how a handmade assembly has been gathering steam and wanting to come very much and to be part of it. I'm trying out a new talk today, combining things that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years. And I'm very much struck by the different talks that I've been to over the last couple of days, thematically, how much we're weaving different threads together. World making, as you mentioned, Hazel, yesterday, but also the notion of mending, of the cautionary note that Kelly brought up the other night. That is something that I think about. So often in the last couple of days, I've been going, yes, I think about that too, or that's in common with my practice. So please ask questions as they come up. I'll try to be as clear as possible, but sometimes what one hears in one's head and what comes out one's mouth aren't the same thing. I've entitled this talk, Making Color, but I think it could also be called Weeds and Schmata. And Schmata may not be a word you all know, but some of you might, and we'll talk a little bit about that, hopefully, as my talk goes on, or any responses you might have to the Yiddish word Schmata, what it might mean. So let's get started. Oh, like a few other people mentioned yesterday, I did my undergraduate at Concordia, but at a time when painting was like supreme, and a very typical type of painting was that done by guys such as Guido Molinari and Yves Gautier, which maybe were not the prime people who were there for some of the other speakers. So somehow I think some of the work I'm doing today in a backhand way goes back to some of those origins. And I only realized that very recently. So let's give this a try. So I do work as a sessional professor at the University of Ottawa. That's one of my jobs. But like so many artists, I've always had at least 2-3 jobs at a time. And this doesn't seem like it's ever going to change. So my second job, other than as a studio part-time professor in sculpture, is as a gardener. And classes end around April 30th, and around April 20th, I'm already outside. And I spend pretty much all summer outside, and now I'm in the middle zone where I'm putting gardens to bed. I work for about 25 people, 25 different clients, and some of the gardens are huge, acres, and some of them are a sidewalk patch. And I've been doing this now for 13 years. And it's given me a lot of time to think. You come out of a classroom where you're very much giving to students, and then head outside to being outside in the rain or in the sun. So some of these gardens I work on all summer. Some of them I'm just there for a cleanup, some of them for putting them to bed. But one of them is a garden that belongs to Jean. It's along the Ottawa River. And it was a treasure hunt when I first got there. It was completely weed infested and couldn't find anything. And the first year the task was find the garden. And over this time, it's allowed me to learn a great deal about plants and the ecosystem in Ottawa. So I've developed different beds, different parts of the garden over 13 years and gotten to know the family who lives there. This is what the garden looked like in April. The Ottawa River decided to do a major flood. And it wasn't just in Gatineau or in Quebec, but also in Ottawa, where there were houses that had major, major flooding. So this garden, Jean's garden, usually starts, as you can tell, around there. So when I got there in April, I went, I don't think I'm going to be gardening yet. And I had to wait a number of weeks before I could start gardening. And this was the kind of sight up and down the street that I was welcomed to, sandbags everywhere, because there was absolutely no flood plan whatsoever. And it very much brought to me on my mind the whole notion of climate change, which I'm seeing through gardening, whether it's periods of drought or periods of flooding, this notion of extremes of weather that's starting to happen. I did that as a backdrop just in terms of a lot of the projects I do are outside and involve plants as my art practice. So Hazel talked about Axneoset in Gatineau, and this is one project from there. One of the first projects I did where I was working with plants, it was a 3-year project done by a landscape architect called Stéphane Bertrand, who lived in the area at the time, who's now in Montreal. And over a 3-year period, every summer, he invited landscape architects, and artists to make site-specific works outside the gallery and sometimes inside the gallery. And it's one of those projects that I really wanted to participate in because there were so many interesting things going on by different people from all over the place. So the project I ended up doing, finally, had to do with living in Ottawa and living in the Italian district, where when I moved there, everybody has their own garden. Tiny gardens made out of whatever they have. And I was renting a house and had access to my first garden, and I was given seeds. And one of the seeds that I really enjoyed growing and learned about was scarlet runner beans. So at Axe, in one of the hallways, I started my scarlet runner beans from seed and grew them in the window there. And when it got warm enough, they were taken outside. Outside in the back of the building, which is an old hosiery mill, a very beautiful building, was the plot I was given. And the plot was made out of the worst soil possible. There were more bricks in there and pieces of metal and gravel and garbage, and that was part of the project. What are you going to do with this actual site? The whole notion of abandoned sites and how in an urban center this exists a lot. Being very naive and starting out doing this project, I thought no problem. So to build my trellises for this project, on my walks to the gallery from Ottawa or cycling, I picked up garbage, which was in the form of, as you can see, umbrellas, mops, molding, hockey sticks. In April, there's a lot of garbage to pick up. People are putting things out. And these became the basis of the structures that I was making that were anchored in this very mean soil. And what happens with these kinds of projects in an urban area is you get a lot of advice, whether you want it or not. People walk through, they ask you, what are you doing? And they tell you, sometimes maybe you should stick to something else, or they're helpful, or they even come and weed with you. So it's a very interesting way to make a community because these projects don't last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I started in April in this project and realized when I finished that it was November. So sometime in August, it started looking like this. Through drought periods, through watering, through getting people to help me with the weeding, I was able to continue growing the scarlet runner beans, and I did have a good crop. These became a series of packages that I made of the scarlet runner beans. The seeds themselves are this beautiful purple and pink. They have these day glow kind of colors to them, although the scarlet runner itself has beautiful flowers. But I made, so you can see the bean pods on the right, the actual what's inside them in the middle, and these kind of condom-like wrappers. And I made out of cereal box liners this whole series of sending these seeds out into the world, and they ended up all over the country for people to be able to plant in their own gardens. A friend of mine at the time had started, Cindy Deachman, had started a zine where she invited me to put a seed in the middle of the zine. So the zine went out across the country, and it was a way to distribute the project. Another project more recently, 2014, I was invited to be part of a new project called Beyond the Edge that has been taking place at the Experimental Farm in Ottawa. We are apparently one of the few countries that has a capital city without a botanical garden. And there is a group in Ottawa, Canadensis, who is trying to make sure we have a botanical garden as part of capital culture. And Ottawa's interesting because there is capital culture and there's a lot of other things going on too. But you tend to have to dig for them, literally and figuratively. So the year I was invited Beyond the Edge, Deirdre Logue worked on a project with her sister that involved all kinds of things, and then there were other artists from the area. I decided what I was interested in doing, since I'm always curious about what's right in front of us, to grow 20 kinds of squash, both the kinds of squash that you would find in your local supermarket and others. So I went to one of the seed fairs in March, picked up 20 kinds of seed, and started growing them. And it was an interesting story in terms of, okay, what's going to happen to them? It's in a public space. There's always the notion, could there be vandalism? And they're rodents, all kinds of wonderful things that dig under the ground and come and take your plants and your produce. But in fact, what became the most dangerous critter were Carleton University students coming back to school in the fall. So this is just a sketch of some of the different enclosures I was thinking of, because I did a fair amount of research into pergolas, into different kinds of structures that are built out of materials that you find. Very straightforward, but are part of garden culture or farming, but also sculptural in my mind. So in this case, this was one site where I grew my squash, seeing it around midsummer, and watching the vines. I was working very much on a vertically. I wanted them to grow not necessarily horizontally, but vertically. Another site was here using horse fencing and rebar, where you could drive a car through it or walk through it. This notion that things can grow on structures, that it's a sculptural intervention as much as it's a plant intervention. What's interesting about the experimental farm is it's used a lot by dog walkers. There are people who go through there all the time. So again, the audience is very diverse. And there was a real sense of ownership for people who use that area, that it's their parkland, even though there's research going on by Agriculture Canada, all kinds of different people. So again, being there looking after the work becomes an inherent part of meeting people there and talking about it, who often spend more time there than you do. Just a close-up of, in the late summer, started having a lot of squash of different kinds. Very much mixing them up together, so you would see very different squash forms next to each other. Here were some of the people who helped me. These were three students from Algonquin College who were following a horticulture program there, and for their community time, they came to help on the project. So it was a wonderful way where you had visual artists working with people from other areas. And they had lots to advise me in terms of what I should be doing, which was great. They also helped with starting to harvest the project. So I ended up with about 150 squash. And it became a question, okay, what are you going to do with them? So the obvious thing was cook. So ended up doing for Culture Days in Ottawa, which was, I think it was September 27th. It was the closing of the exhibition, and I invited 4 chefs to make soup. And it went from a very gentle zucchini soup to very spicy Thai-based soup. It was all kinds of very different things. And about 250 people showed up for soup, and there was a local bakery that just opened who sponsored, who gave bread as a form of promoting their bakery. And people hung out and ate soup and enjoyed the last day of the exhibition, seeing the different pieces that were there. The final outdoor work that I wanted to show you is from this year. And it's probably like most of you, when you're working on a new project, it's an obsession. This one takes place at a project called Fieldwork, which is about an hour and a quarter outside of Ottawa, near a town called Perth. And it's a project that's been in existence for 10 years, started by a collective that is now led by Susie Osler, who's a ceramicist. She has about 80 acres there, and for the last 10 years, she's been inviting artists from the States and across Canada to do different outdoor projects. And has received some funding from the Ontario Arts Council over the years, but it's very much a project that she started and continues. They're celebrating 10 years this year of the collective, and taking a hiatus to think about it. The project has grown to have children, schools involved. It's connected with the International Writers Festival in Ottawa, where they bring writers out to write over a weekend and then actually speak about the writing and read from the poems and stories they've written in the barn. There are now concerts that happen in their barn. All one person on her home who's opened this site to the public. But you can find sculptures that are there from the last 10 years in the woods, how they're degrading, they're very much part of the landscape, how things change. So you see ruins of things, some things that are pristine, some that have sound, the gamut, some that are critical in terms of landscape practices. So it's a very exciting place to visit. It's free, it's open all year long. You can go there in the winter. So to celebrate the 10th year, she invited artists to make work that involved sound. So I ended up working on Apodictor Symphony as a collaboration with an artist called Annetta Hagel. And the great thing with Annetta Hagel is she's very comfortable with working with the digital part of the world, which is something I'm very hands-on. So when we were accepted to do this project that involved sculpture and sound, it turned out that I was fine with the sculpture part. She was terrified of the sculpture part. I was terrified of the media part, and she was totally fine with that. So that was a good collaboration. So we started working with the idea of bringing the sounds, the songs of bumblebees to the site. And we recorded them last year, walking through the site to different areas, and in the fall planted a lot of seeds that we thought would be invitations to bees. And we focused on making nectar pods, because bumblebees don't necessarily go to hives, they make nests, and they make nectar pods. So we focused, and it was a whole material research where we decided in the end, in consulting with somebody I've worked with many times, Adrian Jones, who's an engineer by trade, we ended up working with fiberglass, which is highly toxic. This project I'm still working on in terms of thinking about how poisonous the materials are, and yet has become an outdoor installation. So to work with making nectar pods, we ended up making metal forms, and it became a whole story of how do you make this shell outside this metal form. And we ended up with weather balloons, a lot of saran wrap, all kinds of very low-tech stuff. And winding this goo of resin and fiberglass, it's horrible stuff to work with. And tinting it this yellow. So they ended up looking like this, the nectar pods. We wanted something that was translucent, and this is just in our studio hallway as we were making them and setting them out to look at the forms. Very hands-on, very much the surface is you're very aware of it not being industrial making whatsoever, although the materials are specifically of that world. These are the flight paths drawings of bumblebees that have been recorded. They take on very beautiful qualities of gesture drawings circulating, and it tracks the way the bumblebee goes from wherever they're gathering things out into the world and how they come back. The whole notion of trying to highlight the flight and the song of the bumblebee, since it's so precarious, particularly in Ontario right now. We ended up, a major component was the sound component. We, through working with our, and we'll see if I can explain this even properly. I do understand it now since I did it. Worked with Arduinos, worked with wave shield kits, controlled shield designs. We needed to have something that was activated by the audience on site, so motion detectors that could be started once you were there. So you would walk around the site and trigger these different songs. So this is the kit that we put together and setting it up. It's at the base of each sculpture, and it had to be waterproof because it's out there all the time, as well as there's no electricity out there. So it got into the whole issue of solar panels. So these are the nectar pods as they are right now outside, and we mowed a pathway through the area that follows the flight path of a bumblebee. And as you walk through it, the sound is triggered. With the speakers are in each pod, so there's this sense of the song amplified by being in the pod and inviting you to come closer to hear it. Some of it is of the bee leaving the nest, some of it is of swarms, all different soundscapes for each one of them. And as the site has changed over the course of the summer and now the fall, the grasses have grown very tall and the path has become very dominant. So, trying to make a link here to indoor practices. In 2010, my family and I, we rented our house out and rented a very, very small apartment in Paris, where it was a launch pad to go traveling for 4 months. And I, with 2 children and my partner, one child loved it, one child hated it so much they went home, which is a whole story in itself. I would never suggest taking a 15-year-old out of school and going traveling for 4 months unless they're, well, my child is an extraordinary being, definitely, and she proved it. But I can talk to you more about that afterwards. She's intact and alive today, which is a good thing. I was looking for a project to do while I was on the road for 4 months. And I'd been knitting since I'd been very young. My mother's an occupational therapist, and she taught me all this stuff. There's always hands-on things going on. So the project became a knitting journal, where the wool was picked up as I was traveling, and very much finding colors that had to do with where I was. And it ended up being an installation of scrolls, or as a friend of mine calls them, she calls them your scarves, Deborah, your scarves. Which I don't know if I like as a name, but that's what Petra calls them. And each one very much involved different things that I'd saw, but the whole notion of pattern and color came back in a way I had not expected. So looking at places where my family's originally from and noticing sidewalks, noticing tile work, knowing all kinds of things that I was really excited about. And knitting is a great project to do when you're sitting somewhere waiting on a bus or on a boat, and people always ask you, what are you making? And I can remember being on a subway car and a whole group of women were there and asked me, what are you making? What are you making? And I had a little knapsack where most of the knitting was, and I was just working away. And eventually, because of our conversation, they started pulling on it. And the next thing I knew, the whole thing was in the subway car, and we were talking about all the different impressions of things that were in that piece. So this is an installation I did in 2013 where I was really, how do you show this work? It was a real grappling, and it ended up being pulled throughout the space. Very sensual, different colors that were, I hoped, open things up in terms of patterning, in terms of different motifs that might make people think of different things in their own environments, whether it was stones or oranges. It was quite abstract and yet grounded in things that I had seen. For instance, this one was based on a plane being canceled and looking up at the ceiling for 4 hours. This is a shot from my studio. In 2014, a member of my family, a woman in her 70s, Roselle, unexpectedly died, and she had a practice I was very much interested in. She made handmade clothing, and it was all made out of silk wools that she painted and sold. She sold the clothing and sold it across the states, actually, even in department stores like Bergdorf Goodman in New York City. So she was clearly she was pretty good. And when I'd go visit her, I'd always go to her studio and see what she was working on. And when she died, there were 7 people who inherited all the different things, all the cloth that was in the studio from very, very different practices. She lived in the Vermont area, and one of the shows I really would like to curate, is what have people done with her materials to see, because it's a real cross, very broad sense of practices, but with her materials. What I asked for and was able to get were all the remnants of her collections. So I went to pick them up, and they were in these boxes and garbage bags, and brought them back to Ottawa. And for 1 year, I sifted through them. It was a very bittersweet, very visceral experience, both in terms of remembering what she'd done with these things, the act of painting things, the act of making things, and her perfume was everywhere in the work. It was a very strong, and so it was the sense, am I going to do something with this? Can I do something with this? And being engulfed by all these very richly colored stuff. So one of the things that happened while I was working on this, and I was talking with Ryan about this, Michael Schreier is a Ottawa photographer who comes to my studio once a year, and I go to his studio once a year, and we schmooze, as he said, we schmooze, we talk about work. And he came to my studio when it was in this disarray, and when he left, he said, "Deborah, this might be a strange request, but I would like to have the keys to your studio and come here when you're not here." And luckily, I know Michael fairly well, so I wasn't worried that he might ransack the place. And I was away for a week, and so I said, "Sure, here are the keys." And he came in and he left. And several months later, I went to his house for lunch. He makes you a gourmet lunch, which is just the best thing. And then you see his work. And he said, "I have something for you." And it was a book. And it was a book of the pictures he'd taken while he was in the studio. So this is the cover of the book. And very much through his lens, some of the images he took while he was in that space of things that mattered to him. And I just wanted to show a couple of images from it. Some of them are very close up, some of the scrawls that I've made while I'm trying to think through things, or how he found things on the wall. And it was an exciting thing in terms of my being so lost with this work to see somebody else looking at it through figuratively, their lens. I started making some very small works with scraps from the collection. They're sewn on paper. They're very much sketches where I was using a sewing machine with paper that had come with the collection. It was handmade paper, and with a lot of the wool remnants, wool fabric. It was like a wool cashmere. Very intimate works, and it was the closest I'd come to painting probably in 25 years. The whole notion of the schmata, of the scrap, how it speaks of a past. Is it something to discard? Is it something to save? Is it something precious? These then became larger works. These are about so big, where I was taking some of the remnants that had a form to them already. They weren't just square, they had a form. And trying to highlight that form, and it became quite abstract, trying to find a way to come back to the body, since this was clothing, or clothing. Another piece. Cutting, sewing, hemming, taking the painted fabric, the information that I was giving, and trying to find my own voice with it while being very aware of Rozelle's voice. Taking some of the materials and handling them, folding them, putting them together in different ways of not even changing them other than by their positioning. It just gives you a sense of the range of color and patterning, all hand-painted. And in one show that I was in, I just brought my ladders to the space and put them in one of the entryways and took the various remnants and positioned them in various places. That was the introduction to the show. It led to me wanting to do my own painting on fabric. So I ended up going to gouache on paper, but picking paper that was very much rice-based, very absorbent, realizing I was trying to make my color really go into the pores of the paper, that it was going through the paper, that it was very much influenced by different patterns I was picking up as I was starting to group the fabrics that are on the left here, to taking scraps of the material, inserting it into the paper, gluing it, then drawing with it with inks again with gouache, thinking, as we've been talking about, two sides of the paper or two sides of the fabric. To what are thinking about how could I join the gardening work I do with the notion of painting that was starting to come in with my work. One of the influences that came up was looking at Piet Oudolf, a landscape architect's photographs of his own gardens. And he believes that plants, his selection of plants, it's just as important for when they're alive to when they're dead. And this is one of his pictures that he takes with his garden in the winter. So I just wanted to show you those, the whole notion of not something necessarily alive, but something dormant, and how he was thinking of those kinds of, as a garden as well. The fact of dormancy, not death, but the whole notion of cycle. So last winter, I started working with some paper that a friend had given me, Maura Doyle, who's a sculptor and also has her studio next to mine, she gave me. They were these squares of rice paper that she picked up in Vancouver when she lived there. And I started trying to think, what is the color of a winter garden? As part of also a commission I'd been given by the Ottawa Art Gallery. They ended up being this book of skins that I've been grappling with what to do with them. This is on the studio floor. There are about 20 of them all now. Again, it's a paper that's very translucent, that I'm very aware of two sides. And it really pushed me to do something I've been wanting to do for a long time, which was to make my own color. As Kelly mentioned the other night about Rebecca Burgess and her ideas of the fiber shed, this is a book I came across a couple of years ago that got me really excited in terms of the whole notion of making my own color. I garden, I pick out weeds, I'm constantly dealing with stuff. What if I was making my own color from plants? And Rebecca Burgess got me thinking I might be able to do it. And you know, you need a catalyst. And, but interesting enough, as much as her book ethically is really interesting and philosophically interesting in terms of plants and color, it turns out that most of the plants that she talks about and shows in her book are from a climate entirely different than ours. They're much more about the United States Southwest and desert conditions. So as I've been trying to do some of her recipes, I've really found out it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work in Canada, where we are. So this is another shot of one of the paperwork suspended that I'm working on in the studio to find the right way to present it. So, because of this commission I got from the Ottawa Art Gallery, it was time to make a garden. And I looked into a number of sites to do it. They didn't work out, so I said, fine, I'm going to do it in my backyard, which is usually a total mess the whole growing season, because I have no time to look after it. So in April, I had a cubic yard delivered. I found a bunch of pots, both from trees that had been planted, from various people, borrowed containers, and started filling them with earth. Put them in the corner of my garden, bought all kinds of plant seeds that I thought might work. And then, it being Ottawa this year, it rained, and it was cold, and then it rained some more, and then it rained some more, and then it rained some more. And I thought, and this is the chance with these projects, it may not work. They may just all drown. So here we are in July. Normally it would be about 30, 35 degrees in Ottawa at this time of the year. It was about 15 or 16. And I thought, well, got lots of foliage. And then in August, the sun came out, and I started getting some blooms that I started being able to collect. I picked things that were easy to grow, zinnias, marigolds, cosmos, things that I knew would be able to handle my neglect. I also started foraging. And this is just the beginning of collecting some of the plant matter. And as I was collecting, I was going, okay, Deborah, now you can start making the dyes. I was also in Petit Cap, about a half hour from here, in August on holiday, and it was a wonderful way to extend the practice of going for walks and foraging. One morning, I went walking just down the main road, and as you can see, there's a lot of goldenrod in bloom, and went for a walk and was able to come back with about 10, 15 different plants that then took back to Ottawa. So that opened the practice in a whole new way of not just in thinking of my own garden, but what's right out here in front of us. Ready to start dyeing, did my reading, did my homework, found out that there's a whole process of preparing the fabric called mordanting. I didn't know anything about mordanting. I didn't know where the rule was to try to find the materials in the landscape where I lived. Started to look for oak acorns. I have to be honest, wasn't sure where I could find them, what they even looked like. Was working on one garden where I'm working for 7 years now, taking out the weeds, and I realized the whole site is filled with oak acorns that I haven't figured out what they were, even though I'd been there for 7 years. So started collecting oak acorns all over the town. City Hall has a great oak tree to collect from. And on a residency in August, I started cooking. And I was petrified. Is this gonna work? Maybe not. Maybe you've been kidding yourself the whole time. So luckily I was given a space outside, an outside patio, and was able to set up a dye kitchen, which really is very basic. It's not, what I like about this work is we're not talking, it's about things you can find at the hardware store, at garage sales, you can borrow from people. It's tech friendly, and started cooking. The residency took place on a farm owned by a cook called Jamie Kennedy, who has done a lot of work in Toronto, but now works mostly from his farm, serving meals once a week to people who come to taste his stuff. And we had access to his market garden, so we could take food stuff from there both to prepare meals, but there was also stuff I was able to collect. And I ended up making dyes, both at the residency and for the last 3 months. I've been cooking and finding out what happens with the plant matter. Have also started a book of all the samples. It's been a whole trip about chemistry, cooking, the fact that the various books I read completely contradict each other. In the order of doing things, what's important, what's not important, even the colors that I'm going to get. A small project that I made involved sewing 15 pieces of cotton sheeting and ended up dyeing them at the workshop, at the residency, very much based on the different plants that I was finding there. And gave them on the last night of the residency to the various people there, which was turned out to be all women, 12 women, and 2 women who organized the whole event, where we were there for 10 days. There were people from Europe, across Canada, and the States, where it was about making art and food. So we had to cook meals for each other. Each house cooked meals. And we each had spaces to work on our own practice, which ranged from people who were architects who run, she runs a wonderful art gallery in Albany, New York, where art and food come together as a practice for artists, to painters. It was also multi-generational, from 24 years old to 69 years old, glass blowers. The practices were very divergent. So here's our Last Supper, and I made these little packets where I folded the material in the room, in the dining room. I brought my sample book and a selection of dyes that I had made over the last 10 days. And these folded forms, napkin-like forms, were placed on each plate for each person with plants that I had found in the area immediately around the dining room, both in the bike paths, in the fields. And this is the space in construction. The Ottawa Art Gallery has existed for 25 years, and it's having its first purpose-built space made for them, which is to open in December. And the work I've been doing will be here. This was in July when I got to see the space, and very rough at that point, but it's an exciting time to have a space where it's going to be 5 times the size of what they've been working in up to now, which is in the former courthouse, and will hopefully have a really strong range of programming, both internationally, nationally, as well as very much from the community. And that's where I'm ending. So, any thoughts from anybody in the audience about what a schmutta can be? Or anything else? Big stuff in Montreal, which is where I'm originally from. Oh, okay. Funnily enough, my son, he's 25, he was working in a startup in Montreal, and he went to be interviewed for the job, and he sat down and he realized he was sitting in the offices of his father's family former tie business. All the paneling was still there. At the time he'd been there before they were still producing silk ties. The commission has been to make a dye garden, to harvest the plants, and then to make a work from that. And I'm incorporating both the paperworks that I showed from the winter work with the actual dyeing. And what's been interesting about the dye part has been learning what fabrics do I want to use. So in the end, it will be these different, very minimal pieces that are color saturated, very dependent on what they were made of and where that dye stuff came from. So it's an interesting conversation in terms of what they will be given, what they're going to take. So I've made this, at this point, the plan is to bring all the work there, to install it, and they will make a selection from it of what they want to take as part of the collection, as well as instructions on how to make a new dye garden. So in a funny way, there's a connection with Saul LeWitt's work when he makes a wall piece and the notion of instructions. It's mostly for dyes at this point, yeah. But certainly I could see it going elsewhere, you know, in terms of cooking and eating. I'd like to do more foraging in that area. I live in a very intense urban area, and yet I'm really curious about how there are things all over the place that are just sitting there being ignored. I have a lot of paper bags.
Yeah? Like, I saw that there were a lot of them were in jars.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now, as I've been making the dyes and trying to figure out how long they last as well, because that's become part of things. I love garbage days. Yogurt containers are really good. My understanding, Kelly has much more experience in this than I do, is as long as it's covered and there's not a lot of air coming in, the dye will last quite a while. I found mason jars, wine bottles are really good, Perrier waters, any kind of mineral water, so that becomes part of it too. Last week I found somebody, one of my neighbors has kombucha that she's drinking out of these huge sucker bottles. So I'm a junk collector, and it's very useful to be finding these containers. So I have a whole corner of my studio where I'm just, I've been cooking these dyes, and I've only really started working with the fabric to find, and I'm finding the dyes change over time. So the goldenrod I made in August was quite light, and when I started dyeing with it more recently, the color's super intense now. So that's it. It's a lot of discovery.
Yeah.
And sometimes getting a plant where you think, okay, I'm going to get a great color, and you get nothing. But for people who are taking the dye workshop tomorrow, I have examples of people's work where they're incorporating into work. And one guy, Carl Stewart, he's a weaver, but very much a contemporary art practitioner. He's open to going out and trying any plant he finds to see what he can get out of it, which has been really kind of interesting rather than the book. Okay, can anything happen with this?
Yeah.
It's interesting, even though it's 4 hours away, it's quite different from Ottawa. Who I did meet, who spoke about, is Victoria Taylor, who is a landscape architect.
Yeah. She
And,
ran the Derail
Yes.
workshop.
and she happens to be Jamie Kennedy's girlfriend.
Yeah.
So she was there when I was there, and she took people foraging for flowers for the dinner arrangements, and the residents were all invited to make flower arrangements, which was amazing, actually, to be in the kitchen while this very intense meal was going on and helping to prepare for it. Yeah, so that's the closest I've got to him, but he's on my list.
Yeah.
Hi.
He's very welcoming to the questions and inquiries.
Because I'm very interested, it can be wastelands, he's going into, as with Derail, places that have been left abandoned and finding materials.
He's using more.
Yeah.
which take weeks to make, months. It's the whole notion of soaking and time, which is also part of this kind of practice. You don't just squirt it out of the tube. Or the acid dye workshop I went to 2 weeks, take a few drips of this, a few drops of it, and it's done. So it's interesting, the whole notion of where does color come from? And I've had a few painters recently tell me, you're being very holistic, Deborah, or you're really going backwards. And I'm thinking, that's not the intention. It's actually to be very present here today, trying to address some of your concerns. Well, art making, as my partner says, is my compulsion. Is a compulsion an obsession? Is a compulsion an addiction? Making things is my addiction. For me, there's been a wonderful synchronicity that I didn't expect to happen between the work I do with plants and coming inside. That's been very exciting for me because I've thought of it as very separate over the years. And this beginning, and it's very new, of these things coming together seems incredibly open. And in terms of, as Susie talked about yesterday, restrictions and looseness, it feels very exciting to me, and I hope it will go for quite a while. I get restless, and I don't like repeating myself. So there are bodies of other people say, well, I like the gumball series and things I've done in the past. And when it starts becoming predictable, then I'm in trouble. But there's a lot here that's totally lacking in predictability that is very inviting to me. I can see it in both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the idea is it's not verified. It's not hard to do. It doesn't involve equipment that's expensive. It's something that is to be shared very much.
Yeah.
So
it's a very generous project.
yeah, I would really like it to be that it's something for obviously I think people who make things are interested in it, but people who grow plants are interested. And what I've discovered over the years is some form. Most people have some form of a garden, whether it's a small fake plant inside, or a 22nd floor balcony garden, or this tiny piece of land they have at the front of their house, or somebody who has an estate. But those spaces are, we all try to make, in terms of road making, gardens, spaces for ourselves. And I'm very curious about various gardens of Eden or paradise that people make for themselves, whether it's out of organic matter or inorganic matter, which I think is a very human compulsion to do. Happy to keep talking to anybody about it.